Hi, everyone. It's great to see you again. And to our newest friends, welcome. We're so happy that you've joined us in CFA Society Mexico. Please drop us a line in the chat and let us know who you are and where you're based. We'd love to hear from you. My name is 𝒤𝒊𝒏𝒈, CFA. I'm a managing partner of Providence Heights Capital Management, a hedge fund investing across the capital structure based in Chicago. I'm a co-founder and president of Collaborative WIM. Since 2019, I've served on the board of CFA Society Indianapolis and as a CFA Institute Research Challenge Judge, Grader, and Industry Mentor. In 2020, CFA Society leaders around the US created Collaborative WIM with our shared mission in mind, to further inclusion and diversity and the advancement and development of female leaders of all backgrounds. Today, Collaborative WIM is a global alliance of more than 90 CFA societies, FPA chapters, and industry groups across the US, Canada, Caribbean, EMEA, and Latin America. And we are grateful to the leaders around the world who've dedicated their incredible talents, time, and endless passion to our shared vision. We're especially thrilled to highlight for you all the very first Latin American CFA Society to host a Collaborative WIM series event, CFA Society Mexico. Thank you to our very dear friends, especially 𝒘𝒊𝒕𝒉, Cristina Cardenas, and Mara Haddad for your leadership. We are so privileged to welcome our amazing friend Parneet Pal for today's interactive discussion. With that, I'd like to introduce my dear friend and Collaborative WIM co-founder, 𝒂𝒊𝒕𝒉, for a few words about today's program.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We are so happy to see you all here. And my name is 𝒂𝒊𝒕𝒉. I'm a Senior Director of Capital Markets and Investor Relations at Realty Income, and also an Advocacy Chair of the CFA Society San Diego, and as Sarah mentioned, one of the co-founders of Collaborative WIM. And I would like to say special thank you to our hosts today, CFA Society Mexico, for hosting this wonderful event, and our amazing speaker. And I'd like to pass the stage over to Cristina Cardenas for just a few introductory remarks. Cristina?
Thank you so much, Victoria. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. As Sarah highlighted, we are thrilled to be the first society in LATAM to be hosting an event of this nature with collaborative women in investment management. So thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you so much also for...
Oh.
Sorry, my microphone didn't go very well. For covering a topic that is so relevant for those of us working in a very stressful sector, which is the financial and the investment management sector. I'm very excited and very much looking forward to hearing from her about how to deal with loneliness, stress, and uncertainty, and to lead better lives and careers. Special thanks to obviously all the team at Collaborative Women in Investment Management, and especially to Guillermina Pagaza, Executive Director here at the CFA Society in Mexico, for all the work and the effort put into this event. I hope you all enjoyed the event as much as I'm expecting it. And back to you, Victoria. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. And everyone, before we hear from our speaker today, I know you're all anxious about the program, but first we have an opportunity for you to network and meet some of the new friends, and maybe connect with some of the old friends that you've met, be at this forum or maybe anywhere else before. And just in a moment, you will be transitioned into breakout rooms where you have about 10 minutes to network and discuss today's topic with everyone in your group. And to make this breakout room easier for you, we have an icebreaker question that you could all share and kind of go around the room and discuss, and that's related to our today's topic. And the question is the following. Just share with your group, where does the stress show up in your body, and how do you experience stress, and how do you think it impacts your focus, your emotions, your ability to make decisions and solve problems, and particularly as a leader. So remember to just introduce yourself and discuss the topic of stress and how it shows up in your body.
Hope that you enjoyed the time in the breakout rooms and you had some great conversations with your peers. My name is Ariel Bitoni, CFA CFP. I am the Chief Wealth Strategist of Refresh Investments, an RIA based in Santa Monica, California. I serve on the board of the collaborative WIM, and I am also the chair of the CFA Los Angeles Women's Group. I'm especially excited for our featured program today, and I also have the pleasure of introducing our guest speaker, Parneet Pal. Parneet is an educator, science communicator, and well-being expert working at the intersection of business, lifestyle medicine, which includes nutrition, exercise, sleep, stress management, mental and emotional health, and also behavior change. A Harvard and Columbia trained physician, she looks for connections and interdependence within human and planetary systems that makes them resilient and regenerative. Her work is focused on solutions for business leadership that architect the future of an equitable society, a well-being economy where health is the default. As we begin our program, just a couple of housekeeping items. We'd like to, if you haven't already, please open up your chat box, and we'd like you to feel free to ask questions and make comments during the chat session. Following, we will have a dedicated time for Q&A with Parneet. So when we get into that session, we'll ask that you use the raise the hand function on Zoom, and we'll give you the opportunity to come off mute and ask your question. You can also direct message me and put it in the chat as well, and I'd be more than happy to ask the questions on your behalf. Last but not least, if you're able to switch your cameras on, because we'd love to keep the conversation interactive. Parneet, thank you so much for your time today. Your work focuses on topics that are relevant in so many ways and issues that as a community, we are all currently experiencing.
Thank you so much, Ariel, and hi everyone. It's really wonderful for me to be spending a little bit of time with this, I have to say, a really fantastic community of amazing women, and I think there are some men who've joined us as well, so that's wonderful. And yes, special thank you to you, Ariel and Sarah, for making this happen, and to CFA Mexico for sponsoring this event. Yeah, I'm really excited to get into all the topics and see and have a good discussion, really.
Likewise. So let's kick it off with our first question, and it pertains to the title of our event. So the title is Leading with Courage and Connection. And I'd love if we could take a moment, if you could explain to us what is leading with courage, and also how do you define building connection?
So, if we just kind of step back and take a look at like everything that's happening in the world around us, I think now more than ever, we're sort of at this inflection point in our history as leaders, but especially as women leaders. And I feel that the two qualities of courage and connection are sort of the necessary foundation for us making it through all the challenges that we are facing. So when I think about leading with courage, I kind of think of it on two different levels. So the first level is when you look at the macro crisis that we see, right? So we have an economic crisis, we have a political crisis, we have, after the pandemic, we're all experiencing a health crisis. And I think tying all of these together is, the climate and sustainability crisis, right? So if we destroy our planet, nothing of what we're talking about right now even matters. And it's not that we don't have the technology and the solutions for each of these crises. In fact, when it comes to the science, when it comes to the technology, when it comes to the solutions, they are all there, right? But I think what's really lacking is that kind of leadership will and political will in these many sectors to enact those changes, to make those solutions available, not just to a select few, but really to as many people in the world as possible. So for me, the first thing about leading with courage is, can we as leaders, and especially as women leaders, develop that kind of moral and ethical fiber to think about our businesses, our work, and these crises in a more integrative way? And then sort of on the more kind of micro and individual level, and I think, after the pandemic, we've all been feeling this, is we're experiencing, higher levels of anxiety, we're experiencing higher levels of depression and loneliness. Burnout rates across industries are through the roof. And so at that level, I think leading with courage means, can we acknowledge the state of our well-being? Can we take the time and have the courage to invest the energy that we need to take better care of ourselves? And can we start to, both when we think about courage at sort of the macro level and micro level, in both those situations, it involves the skill, and it really is a skill, because very few of us are born with this. It's something that we need to train ourselves and develop the skill, is that when we face something difficult, can we lean into that discomfort? Can we hang with that difficulty? Do we have the ability to navigate those difficult emotions in a skillful way? But then I think very importantly, have the wherewithal to make those decisions that are good, not just for ourselves, but for the maximum number of people around us. So, so for me, that's the essence of, leading with courage. And then Ariel, you also mentioned connection. I think we've all read the news stories about the effects that all the working from home and, social isolation after the pandemic had on our mental health. But even before the pandemic, loneliness, unfortunately, is a huge health pandemic globally. And especially in the US, before the pandemic, 61% of Americans reported feeling lonely. And a lot of them, the majority of them, were millennials and Gen Z. So it's not something, typically we associate loneliness with something that only happens later on in life. But what we're noticing is that more and more of us are feeling lonely. And this feeling of loneliness it affects our health, right? So we have, a greater tendency to develop heart disease or dementia or depression down the line. But then at work, when we show up feeling lonely and disconnected, again, the research shows that, our productivity goes down, our engagement goes down, our creativity goes down. We're less likely to be, stick around in the jobs, that we have. I mean, the Great Resignation and the Great Reshuffle, it's no surprises there that, that came up. And I think for us especially part of, this particular group, in our conversation before, it was being mentioned that the whole reason that, Ariel and it's you and Sarah and others, you created this community was because of that sense of, isolation that you've been feeling in the finance industry as a whole. And for me, as somebody who has been part of, the science and medicine industry, it's a very similar situation there. So, women in STEM, because of that kind of very competitive, sometimes toxic work cultures that we're exposed to, and we don't have that kind of support, 50% of women in STEM leave those industries within the first 10 years of working there. So I think, when it comes to building connection, for me, it's about, do we have the ability to take the time to build authentic connections, meaningful connections, and also remembering that when it comes to our health, when it comes to our longevity, the research clearly shows that the strongest predictor of whether you're going to live long and live healthy is the strength of your relationships.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I'm curious if others felt this way in their chat room, was even though we are from all over the world, we can all relate instantly when we talked about our feelings about stress. And it just felt like so comfortable in the breakout room that I was in when we were sharing. We all felt very similarly dealing with a stressful situation, no matter what our backgrounds were. And specific to that, so with regards to that icebreaker question, it was two parts. One was physically how we react to stress. And I'm curious if you could share with us, Parneet, how does this relate to building connections?
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you noticed that kind of commonality, right? I mean, at the end of the day, we're all humans. We our biology and our physiology is shared. And by the way, I'd love to hear from everyone. I want this to be a dialogue and a conversation and an interaction. So please feel free to post in the chat room some of what you discussed. In your breakouts. I want to know, where does stress show up in your body? How does it impact your ability to focus or to make decisions so, you know, as we're talking, please feel free to post those comments in the chat room. So, you know, from a physical standpoint, Ariel, you know, I think everyone is familiar with the fight or flight stress reaction. And if you're not, it means that when our brain detects that one of our basic survival needs is not being met, and those are the needs for safety, the need for reward, and the need for connection. So anytime we feel that those needs are not being met, unconsciously, right? This is an unconscious response in our body gets activated, which is called the fight or flight stress response. And we're all familiar with that, right? Like our heart rate goes up, our palms start sweating, we start breathing a little bit quicker, and our muscles tense up. And really our body is getting ready to either fight or flee. And again, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with, the evolutionary backdrop of this response. So, hundreds of thousands of years ago, our ancestors, when they were hunters and gatherers out in the wild, and there was a tiger coming at them, the way that you had to protect yourself was through this fight or flight response, right? That is the appropriate response. And now in the 21st century, if you're walking down the road and there's a car coming at you at top speed, you need this fight or flight reaction so that you can get out of the way and protect yourself. So this is a good response. It's an appropriate survival response. But the problem is that our brains, unfortunately, can't tell the difference between an oncoming car and what somebody says to us in a meeting, or what somebody says to us in an email, or the media stories that we're reading on TV or our Instagram feed, right? So what ends up happening is that we go through our day constantly being bombarded by all of these stressful triggers, and unconsciously we're mounting that fight or flight stress response in the body. So, when we're in the state of chronic stress, of course, that has ramifications for, downstream. We are at greater risk for developing diseases like heart disease and diabetes and cancer and a lot of the anxiety and depression and so on. But I want to speak a little bit to what happens in that moment, because I think especially as women, and especially as women in, as we're working in our everyday lives, it's really important to keep in mind that two things happen here. And this is, to your question around connection, Ariel. So we develop this kind of tunnel vision, right? Because in that moment when we're feeling stressed, it's all about that tiger, right? So what happens is that the body is primed, our biology is primed to be self-focused in that moment, right? So in that moment, I don't care about the people around me. All I want to do is save myself. So if you extrapolate that now to a board meeting or a team meeting or what's happening in our businesses, and you think about, we're all kind of dealing with our own stressors in our business and our personal lives, and we're coming together trying to solve hard problems and trying to make the best decisions. But a lot of us, unfortunately, are coming in with that kind of tunnel vision. And so that tendency towards self-focus, it's very natural. But I think it's something we need to be aware of, because it's going to get in the way of collaboration, right? We're going to have less of a tendency to trust others in that moment, because we're just going to be thinking about ourselves, and that's going to be reflected in the decisions that we make, whatever the problem it might be that you're trying to solve. So that's the first thing, is to keep in mind that if you show up for those important moments at work or at home in that stress state, you're less likely to think about the people around you. Even though consciously you might love others or you might want to do the best for others, just know that if you're in that state, that's, your biology will restrict you to a certain extent. And then the other thing that's really important to remember in that stress state is that if it's about protecting myself from the tiger, the rest of your brain does not care about any other ideas that you might have about anything else except for that tiger. And so what happens is that the blood flow to the different parts of the brain that are involved with our creativity, with our memories and our experiences that give rise to our best ideas are compromised. And so what ends up happening is that right in the moment when we need to have tap into our best ideas is exactly the moment when that ability is compromised. And so what ends up happening, and thank you for those of you who've been posting in the chat room about your response to stress, I think we all notice that we end up saying things and doing things that we regret later, right? We've all developed certain coping mechanisms. We might reach for food, or we might become workaholics, or whatever your coping mechanism might be in that moment, that may not be very skillful in the long run. So hopefully that helps you to get a sense of why being in that state is not the ideal place to build connection from.
Interesting. So as you were saying that, Parneet, it made me think, if we're put in a situation where we feel this type of stress, and because of our biology, our reaction is to either produce fight or flight, is there any other choice besides those two? Can we retrain, as you mentioned earlier, which makes me feel very hopeful that there is a way for us to kind of develop better coping skills. So I would love to hear your thoughts on, is there another choice? And then how does this fight or flight, and if there is another choice, how does this relate back to our topic of courage and connection?
Yeah, so and I think this is why we're all here today, because I don't want to be sort of like the messenger of doom and gloom. There's a lot of good news here. And the good news is that, especially as women, we have literally a biological superpower. It's not that men don't have this ability, but our biology, we're just primed again in stronger ways to respond to stress in a different way. So yes, absolutely, we have a different choice in that moment of stress, and that different choice is called the tend and befriend stress response. So that's a very technical research-based term, but in common language, it's more commonly known as the compassionate response. So it's a really fascinating part of our biology. And, when we understand the origin of this response, I think it makes so much sense. And then we can talk a little bit about, how do you train that response so that becomes your default more and more, rather than the fight or flight. And I think that'll address the question that you had, Radhika, as well. How do you navigate and cope with these stressors if you've only known the fight or flight response? So again, I want you to, think about, back in the day, hundreds of thousands of years ago. Imagine that you were out there, you were that hunter-gatherer, and you were a woman hunter and gatherer, right? So what was happening back then was that, before, through our evolution, we went from walking on all fours to walking on two legs. And as we did that, what happened with our pelvis was that our pelvis became narrower. And what this meant was that babies, when we were pregnant and babies were being born, the gestation period decreased. And so when babies are born, they were less further along in their development compared to other species. And so when a baby is born, it's helpless. We have to take care of it for many, many years before the baby can become independent. Now imagine that you are a mother, a hunter-gatherer mother with a newborn baby in the wild, and there's a tiger coming at you. And if you only have the fight or flight stress response at your disposal, what's going to happen? So Ariel, I'll ask you, what would your response be in that situation?
Do I have a choice of protecting my baby, or I have to? That's
if you only had, that's a good question, right? So if you only had the fight or flight response at your disposal, you would run the hell away to protect yourself, leaving your baby, and unfortunately, the baby would not survive, right? Yeah. Right? Exactly.
I don't want to say that, but
yeah. But that's that's the nature of the fight or flight response, right? It's all about you, and it's all about protecting yourself. And clearly that would not be a good idea if we wanted to propagate our species. Right. And this is why, and I always get chills when I talk about this, because it's such a beautiful response of our biology. So our brain and our body developed a counter response to fight or flight. And in order to do that, three things had to happen in the brain and our biology. The first is that the mother had to have the sense of great attachment and bonding and love and caring and connection to her baby to want to make her to protect it in the first place, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is that she had to become fearless. She had to have this courage in that moment of danger to say, okay, tiger, doesn't matter. I'm going to protect my child and myself, you know, bring on your worst. And so she had to overcome and override whatever fears that she had and to be highly motivated in that moment to take some action. And then the third thing is that, you remember we said in fight or flight, like, we don't have access to our best ideas. So even if she had the motivation and she had that, you know, caring, if she came up with like a really lousy idea, that would not be useful either. And so the third thing that had to happen in our biology was that we had to develop a system where we could access our best ideas, where we had sort of a clarity of our vision of what to do. And the most amazing thing is that that's exactly what our brain and bodies have developed. And this is the tend and befriend stress response. So this is, and it comes online through the action of 3 hormones. And the first hormone is oxytocin. And oxytocin, you know, a lot of you may be familiar with, like, it's like the love hormone or the cuddle hormone. You know, it has many different functions. It's very important during pregnancy and childbirth. It's really important, you know, during breastfeeding. It's very important, you know, when you have, you know, in your intimate encounters with your partner as well, you produce a lot of oxytocin. But oxytocin increases our levels of caring and connection and empathy and trust with another person. So that's the first thing that happens. But oxytocin is also an amazing anti-stress hormone in that moment. So it helps to lower your stress. It helps you to build this kind of feeling of warmth and connection with the person that you're with. So oxytocin levels go up, dopamine levels go up, and dopamine is a hormone that's going to help you to reduce that fear. So it goes, you know, that alarm center in the brain that's going off with fight or flight, dopamine helps to calm that down a little bit, and it steps up your motivation and gives you that drive to take action. And then the third hormone that is produced is serotonin, and serotonin is a hormone which gives you that clarity of thought and helps you to come up with your best ideas. So you know, it's just amazing that we have this response has developed, and we've all participated in this response. You know, you may not have thought of it deliberately, but think of a time when you were stressed, and in that moment of stress, you did one of 2 things. One is either you reached out for help, like you called somebody or you texted somebody and you say, hey, help me, you know, I'm not feeling so good in this moment. Or think of the moment when even though you've been feeling stressed, you still took the opportunity to go out and help somebody else, right? We've all been there. We've been feeling stressed, and yet we go and we help somebody else in that moment. So those are both examples of the tend and the befriend stress response. And again, that's just a very technical way of talking about the compassionate response, which is that you notice stress and suffering in yourself or in others, and then you're motivated to take action to alleviate that suffering. So this is sort of the amazing ability that women have. We are naturally more inclined, because we have higher levels of oxytocin, we are naturally more inclined to tap into the tend and befriend stress response. So the question is, can we train ourselves to lean into that response more often rather than the fight or flight?
Interesting. I would love if folks who, as you were saying that, Parneet, so many things were going through my mind, which I want to share a couple of them. But for those of you who have either experienced it, or I'm thinking of movies that depict it, I would love just put in the chat, yes, or give an example. I have young kids, so we watch a lot of cartoons, and the one that came to mind as you were sharing about how the woman just changes and doesn't run away. It's called the Mitchells versus the Machine. For those of you who've seen it, who have little kids, I'm sure it's been a popular one. The mother turns into a superhero because her family's being attacked and she doesn't know what to do, and she's kind of meek. And then she just transforms. And as you were explaining that, Parneet, all I could think of was that scene. And it's very entertaining. And it really just puts into visuals exactly what you said. Kind of everything comes together. She has clarity, and, you know, she becomes a superwoman. So I it really pulled it together when you said that.
I love that, Ariel. And that's exactly it. You know, we've all heard those stories, especially I think sort of the extreme stories, you know, like the mother who is able to lift a whole heavy car to protect her child underneath. I mean, those are those extreme examples, but just know that each one of us has that ability and that resource at all times. And we sort of have this edge. And we're very lucky, and not to like isolate any of the men in this conversation. I mean, men have access to this response as well. It's just that it comes easier to women just because of our biology.
Yeah. Tell us how to unlock it.
Yes, how to unlock it. That is a big question. So just like everything else in life, we have to practice, right? So I want you to, you know, you're all amazing women doing such wonderful work in finance. And I'm sure you've had to go through many years of training, right? Like the first time that you opened that Excel spreadsheet, it was, you know, it was really confusing. And then the more you used it, the better you got. And it works exactly the same way. So in our brains, our ability to tap into that compassionate response, we're all born on a scale of like low to high. You know, there are some people you may have noticed who are just very naturally, they're so giving, they're always there for other people. They don't think about, you know, their own selves a lot, and they're constantly giving to others. So they sort of lie on the natural one end of the extreme. And unfortunately, on the other end of the extreme, sort of from a very clinical standpoint, are, you know, is sort of the narcissistic, sociopathic, a range of personalities where there's very little consideration for other people. So most of us kind of lie in the middle of that scale. And what we can do, what we must do if we want to kind of move and improve that capacity is to train ourselves. So how do we train ourselves? Well, you can do it a couple of ways. The first thing is, it's all comes down to our neural networks. So just know that in your brain, there is a specific, you know, there are many neural networks. These are called the pro-sociality networks. These are the networks in the brain that enhance our ability to be kind, to be empathic, to be compassionate and giving to others. And through specific compassion practices, meditation, mindfulness practices, the research very clearly shows that you can strengthen those neural networks. So it's not some kind of woo-woo or intangible methodology. We're tapping into the property of neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity simply means that whatever you practice grows stronger. So if we practice, you know, anxiety, if we practice, you know, frustration or anger, those are the networks in the brain that get stronger. But on the flip side, if we practice calm, if we practice focus, if we practice empathy, compassion, those are the networks that get stronger. So I know, you know, a little bit later we'll be doing one of those practices together. So I'm very happy to share that with you. But that's the first thing. And think of it like going to the gym every single morning. And if you want to train your capacity, then you do 5, 10, 15 minutes a day. And the change happens pretty quickly. You know, the research shows that in just about anywhere from about 7 to 10 hours of practice, you start to notice those changes. And so how that translates, and I think Radhika, thank you for all your questions there about, you know, how do I navigate this fight or flight, or like even the freeze. So the freeze is part of the fight or flight response as well. Where basically you freeze and you don't know what to do next. Again, so I would say, in order to move from that into the tend and befriend more often, invest the 5, 10, 15 minutes a day of that practice. And, you know, there are many apps that you can use. There are many communities of practice that you can join, you know, see if there are many online communities of mindfulness and compassion practice that you can join. So that might be one way for you to do it. And then the second way is do the thing that the response is asking you to do, right? So when you train a muscle, if you do a push-up, that allows you to carry a heavier load of groceries or whatever else might be. So similarly, you know, when you're doing those meditation mindfulness practices, that is allowing you in that moment, in that team meeting, or when somebody else is triggering you in a certain way, to instead of going into that fight or flight, to catch yourself and to move more and more into the tend and befriend response. And similarly, you can start from that response place. So when you're feeling stressed, and I know this will sound really counterintuitive, but the next time you're feeling stressed, stop thinking about yourself, go out and help somebody else. And that's a great way to exercise your tend and befriend stress response. And again, you might say, my God, Parneet, like I have so much on my plate and now you're telling me to go, help somebody else. And my response is exactly, yes, that's exactly what I'm asking you to do, because that will help you to strengthen that muscle. But there are other ways of giving back as well, right? So a lot of you I know in this community are probably, maybe you volunteer somewhere on a regular basis. Maybe you're mentoring somebody, any way that you can give back to others where there is, and remember when you're giving back, with the intention of not receiving necessarily any reward for it. Those are sort of like the strongest ways that you can enhance that muscle. So I hope that gives you some ideas on how we can build this capacity.
Yeah, no, those are great tips. I'm definitely going to put those into my daily routine. I will let you know how I do.
Good, yeah, and it's a practice, and it's important to be kind to ourselves and acknowledge that, with everything that we have going on in our lives and the lives of our families and friends and colleagues, one step at a time, one small step at a time, that's the best way to have that kind of sustained behavior change over time.
Yeah, agreed. In your explanation, specifically when you were describing how women have a tendency to be empathetic and compassionate, those are two terms that some folks tend to use interchangeably. And could you walk us through kind of what your definition is for each of them and how they are different?
Absolutely. So it's really important to distinguish empathy from compassion. And what I'm going to describe now is, what we know from the research. So when scientists study what happens in the brain when we are being empathic versus compassionate, they see some important differences. So there's some overlap in those brain networks, but there are also important differences. So when we talk about empathy, empathy simply means your ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, to see life from their perspective, right? So, and this kind of empathy can happen on two different levels. It can happen at an emotional level, which is called affective empathy, and it can happen just at a very sort of thinking level, which is called cognitive empathy. So, for example, if I'm walking down the road and if I see a homeless person, seeing their suffering can make me feel sad, right? So that's my affective empathy. I can feel their suffering. On the other hand, I can also understand, you can say, oh, wow, this is a very stressful situation. I wonder what happened to this person in their life. And clearly, this is not going well for them. So that's cognitive empathy, right? So you understand, you can take their perspective or you can feel. A lot of the times, you can both feel and think about that situation at the same time. Sometimes you just have one or the other. So that's empathy. And empathy is a very important relational quality, right? So the empathy is the basis of how we build relationships and connections with others. If we don't have the ability to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes and to try to imagine what they are going through, then we can't build a meaningful relationship. So empathy is crucial. But what happens after we feel empathy is fascinating, right? Because just because we feel empathy for somebody doesn't mean that the result or the outcome of that empathy is going to be useful. So when researchers study the outcomes of empathy, they find that there are three possible outcomes. And maybe we can, use an example, maybe a work example is, say you're working on a team and you're working on a deadline and you notice that, somebody on your team is clearly upset. Maybe you can see that they're very stressed out. Maybe they're even, crying, you notice in a meeting. So your empathic response will be, you can see their suffering, you can feel their suffering. The first thing might be, you might say, you know what, I don't have time for this. Like I have a deadline to meet, I have a lot to do on my plate. And so even though you felt and you understood their position, even though you were empathic, your response might be that of avoidance. And again, there's no judgment here. I think it's really important for us to understand this because we've all been there. We've, I can walk by that homeless person. I can avoid, even though I'm empathic, I can avoid doing anything. So that's the first response, is avoidance. The second response is that maybe I'll go up to that person and say, hey, what's going on? Tell me what's happening. I want to understand. And maybe they tell you, what's stressful in their lives. And as you listen to them, you become emotionally distressed. Now their stress has translated into an increase in your stress, right? And then this reminds you of all the things in your life that are not working at that point. And so now not only is that person in that sort of emotional distress, you have now joined that conversation and you go down in that downward spiral. So that's the second possible response, is emotional distress. And this is often something that we see a lot, for example, in the healthcare industry, right? When or with caregivers who have to deal with so much stress and suffering. And they are often very giving people, very empathic people, but often they get caught up in this emotional distress because it's a lot to take on. Mm-hmm. So what you'll notice is in both those outcomes of empathy, it wasn't empathy that was the problem, but it was the response. And in both those situations, that person who was suffering, nothing changed, right? We did not help the outcome of the person that was stressed or suffering. So fortunately, there's a third response to empathy, and that response is what we've been talking about, this tend and befriend, this compassion response. So compassion means you notice that stress and suffering, you engage your empathy, but then you do something very different. You take stock, you pause and you take stock and you say, wait, let me take a look at what do I have to offer? What are the resources I have available now? My emotional resources, my financial resources, other resources that you might have be available. And then you're motivated to take action to relieve that suffering. So this motivation and this taking of a practical action to alleviate that suffering is what this tend and befriend and compassion response is. And as you can see, the outcome is very different. The outcome is that you actually change the situation in one way or the other, right? So, I hope that's clarifying, like the difference between empathy and compassion. So again, it all comes down to, first of all, unfortunately, most of us, unless we read about this or we come to a session like this, these are not concepts that we are taught or that we're familiar with, right? So the first step is just to become aware that this is what's happening in our body, in our mind, and it's affecting our relationships and how we show up. And then knowing that, then we can sort of take that action and say, okay, I want to build my capacity for compassion so that I can be more courageous and build more meaningful connections. And then you can start investing in those practices. Yeah.
So earlier you said, even though our plates may feel very full, still go out there and do it, right? And still kind of show that compassion. Can you tell us what the ultimate benefits are from being more compassionate and taking that on? And what does that look like for people who are actively doing it?
Yeah, so Ariel, the irony is that when we help somebody else, we benefit the most. So I'll say that again. When we help somebody else, we benefit the most, even though, of course, we might help the person out in one way or the other. And this is, I think, a very intentional design of our biology, because as a human species, the only way that we've made it so long is because we've been able to collaborate with each other and we've been able to look out for each other. That's how our species has survived. And so it makes sense that our biology rewards us for this kind of collaboration and help and generosity, right? So that's the reasoning why our physiology helps us. So what happens when we help others in our body? Literally, our heart rate goes down, slows down, our breathing slows down, our blood pressure goes down, our muscles relax. So it's a complete opposite of the fight or flight stress response. So we engage a part of our nervous system, which is called the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest and digest part. So that's the first. So think, when you think of like an anti-stress response, this is the first thing. When you give back to others, you don't have to think about that coping mechanism. Automatically, your body relaxes. And when you engage this rest and digest system on a regular basis, what we find is that, inflammation in our cells. So inflammation is this irritation in our cells to many different triggers and toxins, but it's the starting point for a lot of those diseases, heart disease and cancer and diabetes and anxiety and depression, all of them, they start with inflammation in our cells. So when we engage our parasympathetic nervous system, our rest and digest system, those levels of inflammation go down, which means that our risk for these long-term diseases goes down. Our immunity goes up. Yeah, so we get a boost in immunity, and I know especially right now during the pandemic, we all want that. And then we also find that, so obviously if those two things happen, it means that we are going to be healthier, we're going to live longer, but also when it comes to our building connection and our relationships, I mean, wouldn't you want to hang out with somebody who's nice and giving and looks out for you and has your back? Absolutely, right? And so people who are compassionate find that they have very strong, meaningful relationships. And then I think it's very important to think about the benefits of compassion from an organizational standpoint, right? We're all working in very competitive industries. We have cultures where unfortunately, the tendency is not to think about compassion and giving to others, but there's been some very good research on what happens to those teams and cultures that engage in not romantic love, but it's called companionate love. And which simply means that you care about your team members, right? You look out for them, you have their back. And you sort of have these micro moments of love during the day, and which micro moments of love look like just doing a quick check-in, hey, how's it going? I remember last week you had this very stressful incident happen, how's that going? Or bringing somebody sort of a cup of tea when they least expect it, little acts of kindness. Or even if somebody is going through a stressful time, can you just be that compassionate listener, and just even if you're not able to help them in any direct way, just to be able to be that kind of listening ear, it goes a long way. So when we have a culture at work that is compassionate in this manner, those organizations, they have less turnover, they have greater loyalty, they have better customer service, both internally and externally. Innovation rates are higher in these industries because there's this level of mutual trust and what's called psychological safety in these cultures, right? Because you trust each other, you're willing to take a little more risk, and so that's kind of the breeding ground for innovation as well. So, I mean, I could go on, but I hope that gives you a sense of some of the benefits of compassion, both on a personal level, but also for your teams and organizations.
Yeah, no, it sounds amazing. All of it sounds like a community that we should all want to be a part of and to work together. I mean, you said collaboration, and I couldn't agree with you more in terms of making everything a better place for everyone. So I'm keeping an eye on our time, and I want to make sure that we get a chance to do the mindfulness meditation together. So I would love to turn it over fully to you, Parneet, to walk us through that. And then following it, we'll open it up for Q&A. So I'll take a look through that chat right now, and then we can start that, and then folks can come off mute to also ask you questions.
Perfect. Thank you, Ariel. So what I would love to invite everybody to do is we're going to do this practice. It's just going to be a short practice, maybe 5 minutes. And we're going to engage those neural networks in our brain that help us to lean into discomfort and to respond with greater skill. So I'm going to ask you to please sit up in a way that's alert yet relaxed, and close your eyes. And as you do that, I want you to make sure that your legs are not crossed. So make sure both your feet are planted firmly on the floor to stabilize you. And make sure that your back is straight but not rigid, and the front of your belly is soft. And the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is go ahead and place one or both hands on your heart. So when you place your hand on your heart, I want you to tune into the sensation. So see if you can feel the warmth or coolness of that hand on your heart. Or just how that sensation of touch, that warm, comforting touch feels on your body. So when we offer ourselves this kind of comforting gesture, it stimulates the formation of oxytocin in our blood. So it's a great way to start relaxing the body immediately, especially when you're feeling really stressed. So keeping your hands on your heart, I want you to now tune into the sensation of breathing and see if you can follow your breath in and out of your heart center. So I want you to imagine each inhale and each exhale as if it were coming in and out of your heart. And now with each inhale, I want you to imagine that the capacity of your heart is actually increasing. So with each inhale, you see that your heart becomes a little bit bigger. And with each exhale, you gently dissolve your breath. And now what I'd like you to do is I want you to bring to mind a person that you know or a specific situation in the world that is particularly stressful. So you may want to bring to mind somebody that you know is really suffering in some way. And as you bring them and their situation to mind, I want you to breathe in the awareness of their situation, the awareness of their stress into your heart. So with each inhale, I want you to breathe in the awareness of this person's stress and suffering. And as you do that, I want you to notice that no matter how hard or how challenging their situation might be, your heart has an infinite capacity to hold that stress, to hold that suffering with great care and with great tenderness. So next, I want you to just hold that suffering in your heart with great tenderness and care and compassion. Even though it might be a very hard or difficult situation, just noticing that you have the ability to lean into that discomfort. And to hold it with great gentleness and care. And next, we're going to transform this stress and suffering into compassion and resilience. So I want you to think about what you would love to offer this person or situation by way of your tend and befriend response, by way of your compassion. What would you like to offer this person? What is your wish for this person? Maybe it's a wish for greater strength. Maybe it's a wish for more love, more courage. Maybe there is a practical way, more tangible way that you can help them. So whatever it might be, I want you to now, with each exhale, imagine this wish of your compassion, this gift of your compassion being breathed out and reaching this person. So when we breathe in the awareness of their suffering. We hold it in our heart with great tenderness. And then we use our cycle of breath to transform the stress to compassion, and we breathe out with each exhale this gift of compassion. And finally, I want you to visualize your gift, your offering, reaching this person, the situation, and them benefiting from it in one way or the other. And now I want you to let go of the image of this person and situation. And I want you to tune into your own body. And I want you to tune into maybe your own stress and suffering. Whatever might be most alive for you right now. And I want you to offer yourself your own gift of compassion. So what is the one thing, the one small thing that you can do today to take better care of yourself? Is there somebody you need to reach out to ask for support? Or maybe there's an aspect of self-care that you need to engage with. So just taking this time, just making a note of the one thing you can do today by way of your self-compassion. And as we bring this short practice to a close, you can relax your hand. And please go ahead and take a couple of slightly deeper breaths at your own pace. And keeping in mind, knowing that as you go through your day and the rest of your week and month, at any point, you have the choice you have the choice to engage your compassionate response. With that, I'm going to invite you to open your eyes and maybe move your body just a little bit. And whenever you're ready, you can rejoin this conversation.
Thank you, Parneet, for
My pleasure.
encouraging us to give time to ourselves. I think that's something that is really important, that is often overlooked, especially in our industry. Self-care. Yeah. Wonderful. So let's spend a few minutes. I want to give time to the Q&A, but we also have another question for discussion room. So if we can try our best to squeeze it in, we will. One question that stood out that I would love to give a moment for, because I feel the same way, and I'm sure others do too in this room. What is the best way to close that stress loop we experience constantly? It feels like it's never ending. As soon as we take care of one task and we conquer and move on, something else seems to just replace it.
Yeah, great question. And I think this is something that we all struggle with. So I think a couple of things to keep in mind. When it comes to managing our stress, it's important to remember that we have very little control over what's happening around us, right? So that's the first thing, is like we first need to just stop trying to control others or to control the situation. There's so many factors that are beyond our control. And to always come back to how am I showing up in this moment, right? So always bring the focus back to my response. And that's the essence of resilience. The second thing is, can you shift your mindset in that? So, you have these stressful one thing coming after the other, is to just take a pause. Because again, your body the tendency is, if you just let your body do its thing, it's going to automatically go into that fight or flight. So what you need to do is you need to engage your prefrontal cortex, which is sort of our executive center, and bring that online. And the way that you can bring that online quicker is to take a breath, to take a pause. You can name the sensation that you're feeling in your body in that moment, right? So you can say, I'm feeling anger, I'm feeling frustrated right now. It feels like this burning in my chest or this, pit in my stomach. And when you label those emotions and sensations, you're literally bringing your prefrontal cortex online. And when we bring that prefrontal cortex online, then we can decide. That's when we have that moment of choice and we can say, okay, how do I want to respond right now? So being more intentional about that pause and making that deliberate choice. And it is a very deliberate choice. And it's something that does not come naturally. It's something that we have to train ourselves to do. But the good news is that it gets better. The more we do it, the easier it gets. And we can find ourselves in that moment of stress, of just taking a pause and shifting our state. And from that more resourced space, we can then decide what the next best step is. And I think final thing I'll say here is that it's very important, and the research is showing that it's very important to shift our relationship to stress, shift our mindset about stress. So rather than seeing stress as like this, stress is the enemy, or stress is like, this horrible thing, can we shift our mindset to stress as being enhancing to our lives? Stress, every opportunity that stress gives you is an opportunity for you to strengthen your capacity to show up aligned with your values. So I always like, in a moment of great stress, when I'm freaking out about something and something takes me by surprise, one question that I've learned to ask myself more often is, okay, pause. It's okay, Parneet, just breathe a bit. And then what is the response right now that's in line with my values? And this question has really helped save the situation in many different places. So, I would like to offer that to you, is just ask yourself, what is the best response that's aligned with my values? And when you do that, you're doing a couple of things. One is you're moving away from this tendency that we have to be sort of on the victim end of whatever might be happening to us, and move more into your personal control of the situation, what's within your control. But it also, again, brings that prefrontal cortex online because you're asking yourself a question. So you're moving away from that fight or flight and more into an opportunity where you can make a more intentional choice. And then you can figure out what's needed right now, right? So maybe, and it's going to be different for different situations. So maybe all you can do in that moment is just step away for a few minutes. Maybe you need to step away and get a glass of water. Maybe you need to text a friend or a colleague. Maybe you need to just make a request in that moment or draw a boundary, right? You may need to set some limits. I think it's really important to remember that being compassionate is not the same as being kind and warm and fuzzy all the time, or just being a walkover. That is not what the compassionate response is about. Keep in mind, compassionate response is something that's good for you and for the people around you. So think of like, what is the best response here that's in line with my values, that's going to be good for me to solve this problem, but also in the best interest of as many people as I can engage. And so a lot of the times, especially I think as women in difficult situations, in toxic environments, that might mean that we have that courage in that moment to say no, or to make a request of a boundary, or to set some limits, or to engage in a difficult conversation and have the wherewithal to ask those difficult questions of the person or situation. So I hope that's helpful.
It is. And it also makes us feel better that you get stressed too.
Oh God, please, it's so interesting every time I give a talk or, please don't, I am the most flawed, imperfect person here, as flawed as, and I don't mean that in any kind of false sense of humility, but just like everyone, I have to rely on my practices, and just like everyone, I find, the day that I do the practice, I am more resourced. Of course, the more practice I do, the better I get. But trust me, I have many, many moments where I don't show up the way that I would like to.
We would never know. One other question I want to squeeze in. We aren't going to do the second breakout room. We're going to keep it together here, and I'll ask the question so we can answer it as a group. But I do want to ask this one other question before we go there, Parneet, is the question reads, I would be curious to know your take on this idea that we tend to get too harsh on ourselves in times of stress, that we need/should be able to handle it, being a perfectionist, which I think many of us can share, being in the financial industry. But the idea of power of neutrality, being in the moment, can help navigate and center ourselves.
Great question. So I think what you're alluding to with that question is this. So anytime we notice that kind of perfectionist tendency, or that's kind of self-criticism, I always like to figure out, like, why is my brain responding this way? So I think the first thing is get curious about your responses, right? So no self-judgment. Like every response, every thought that you're having there's a reasoning behind why you're defaulting to that. So get curious about it. Get curious about your responses. I wonder why I'm coming up. Why am I criticizing myself in the situation? And most of the time we find that was just a coping mechanism that we learned through our childhood and our life experiences. And we all have witnessed certain difficult experiences in our lives. And unfortunately, these kinds of emotional and mental skills are not something that are taught to us. And so we do the best that we can. We model the behaviors of our caregivers, and some of them are good and some of them are not so good. And so as an adult, when you find yourself in that situation, the first is, just notice, get curious, be mindful. Oh, that's that self-critical voice again. And then to see if you can shift from self-criticism to self-compassion. So there's a huge difference between self-compassion and self-criticism. Often we use criticism as a motivator. Like, we have this fear that if I'm not harsh on myself, if I don't criticize myself, if I don't hold myself to a ridiculous standard, like, I will fail, my life will go, in the gutter, like the world will fall apart. And so again, this is a great opportunity for us to just step back, take a pause and say, is that really true? Is that thought really true? Or is it, and keeping in mind that, it's just like our liver secretes bile, our brain secretes thoughts and emotions. So just because you're having a thought doesn't make it true. So, and you are not your thoughts, right? So I think it's very important when it comes to mental and emotional resilience is to step away from the thought and to say, is this thought that I'm thinking really true? And then the other thing that you can do is to shift to self-compassion. So when we shift to self-compassion, it's kind of what we did at the end of the meditation, where we say, if this was my best friend that was going through what I'm going through right now, what advice might I give them? What would I ask them to do? And then, engage in that same behavior yourself, right? So it's self-compassion is the idea that we treat ourselves just as we would our best friend or somebody that we truly love. And when we do that, and you can just ask yourself, what is the kindest response possible here right now? What can I do right now to help myself? What is the kindest response? When we do that, again, lots of evidence and research that shows that it's actually more motivating. People who are self-compassionate actually perform better, are more motivated, and are quicker to reach their goals than people who are prone to self-criticism. And the reason is that you acknowledge that, okay, I made a mistake, I experienced some failure, or things didn't go the way that I had wanted them to go, and it's okay, I'm human. So we tap into this, we acknowledge the fact that we are not perfect, that we are human. It's okay to forgive ourselves, to be kind to ourselves. And then when we do that, we can recover from that setback more quickly. And it's more motivating then to take action and to do the next thing that needs to be done. So I hope that helps in shifting sort of this idea of when you see yourself being caught in self-criticism, just ask yourself, how can I be kind to myself, and how can I shift to self-compassion rather than criticism?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, Parneet. This has been so wonderful, and I think we're going to have to make another session to continue because we didn't get through everything we wanted to talk with you about today. So what we're going to do, in lieu of going into a second breakout session, I'm going to ask the question to everyone in the group, and then I will turn it over to Christine for our closing remarks. So before we go there, the last question is, and we'd love for you all to think about this and go ahead, and if you are comfortable sharing, just type it in the chat box, is based on the discussion today, what is one thing that you will do differently as a leader to show up with greater courage and connection? Parneet has given us so many tools to think about and use. So I think that there's definitely a lot for us all to consider and to practice starting today. Parneet, thank you so much for your time today and spending this hour with us. Christine, I'm going to turn it over to you. Don't go yet, everybody. We do have a feedback poll that's really valuable to us. So if you could just take a moment for that, which will come momentarily, we do appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Ariel. And I want to hear the responses from everyone.
Yes,
so
please type
I want
them
to know what was your biggest takeaway. What's the one thing that you might do differently? Yeah, I'd love to hear that. But thank you, Ariel. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone from CFA Mexico again, and for your attention. And I hope this was meaningful to you in some small way.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Parneet. I feel like that was so insightful and so meaningful. And I think something that a lot of us really needed to hear, especially at this time. I think my personal takeaway is self-compassion. I think I've always struggled with that. I think probably I see people nodding in the gallery. So I see you. And, I think a lot of people do, right? When you're in an industry that's, cutthroat in some ways, you kind of, forget about yourself sometimes. And so I think that's going to be my personal biggest takeaway. Anyone else?
Beautiful. Thank you for that, Sarah. Yeah, great reminder for self-compassion. And I see Christina says to respond or react in alignment with your values. Yeah, that's a great prompt.
Mm-hmm. I guess one thing, if we have another minute of your time for a quick question. Yeah, I think for a lot of people, the response to stress is also to avoid, the avoidance tactic. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that? And I'm assuming it's not very effective.
Yeah, so if you're talking about, are you talking about avoidance within the context of empathy, or just avoidance in
avoidance of the source of stress?
Yeah, so that's that's basically one of the ways the fight or flight response shows up, right? So that's just a way that your body and your brain is like figuring out and saying, okay, you know, it's too dangerous now, the tiger, you know, I'm just gonna freeze, I'm just gonna avoid this, and maybe I can go to my Instagram feed or whatever else your choice of, you know, poison might be. So the first step is really self-awareness, right? You can't change something that you are not aware of. So the fact that you are noticing that is a really good sign, and it's a really good first step. And you have to practice, right? How do you change that response? It's literally mechanistically, it's the neural networks in the brain. You know, we've developed that groove and that pattern of responding to that stress in that way. And so the way that we change that is we develop a different route. We develop a different network in the brain that responds to the stress. So my encouragement would be to invest those 5, 10, 15 minutes a day of practice. You can choose either many different techniques of, you know, if you like that kind of compassion practice we did today, that's something you can do. There are many other kinds of compassion practice and mindfulness practice. Maybe you can just, you know, notice your breath and follow your breath in and out for a minute or two. And the more that you practice, you start noticing that you are able to break that loop automatically. Like you don't even have to think about it. So it's just like, you know, when an athlete trains, they train really hard in the gym, and then automatically they show up better on, you know, the soccer field or whatever the field might be. And so when we invest the 5, 10, 15 minutes of sitting and practicing our mindfulness and compassion, then we notice that the next time we feel that stress, you know, you'll be able to step back and you'll literally see, oh, you know, there I go, I'm going to my Instagram feed, you know, what am I avoiding right now? And you can say, you know, let me make a different choice.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting because in my personal exploration too, just learning more about mindfulness and meditation, you know, I've heard it also described as being able to see yourself as like an outsider, almost like the next level of a video game. Yeah. Where you can see your emotions as they come and go and choose to act from there instead of feeling like you are internalizing those feelings.
Absolutely. And what you're describing, that's spot on, Sarah. So that's like this quality of, it's called metacognition. So metacognition is the ability to become the observer. So you can literally observe what you are doing, what you're saying, your thoughts and emotions, but you're doing it in a very detached, dispassionate way. And then you can choose which one do I want to engage with, right? So please know that just because you're having a thought or an emotion doesn't mean that you are that thought and emotion or that you have to engage with it. You can just let it go.
Thank you, Parneet. Just so many great takeaways today. Attend and befriend, rest and digest. Love that one. And a quote that you shared with us, when we help somebody else, we help ourselves the most. And this stuck out to me as being what collaborative WIM is all about, a community of individuals coming together to support each other, and then ultimately those connections and experiences kind of stimulating personal and professional growth. So a big thank you to our talented and courageous friend, Parneet Pal. Thank you to Ariel for moderating and to our hosts at CFA Society Mexico. Thanks to our sponsors and to everyone for participating in today's event. Hopefully everyone made some new connections and gained valuable insights from today's discussion. Just a couple announcements. If you're not subscribed to the Collaborative WIM newsletter, we encourage you to do so. It's full of announcements from friends and allies all over the globe. A few reminders, the Q3 WIM book club event will be with authors Ellen Carr and 𝒘𝒊𝒕𝒉 on their book Undiversified. The Q3 WIM original will be a DE&I focused event. We'll get to chat with Sarah Maynard, Global Head of DE&I at the CFA Institute, and Marlene Timberlake-D'Adamo, Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at CalPERS. And last but definitely not least is the first annual Inclusion and Diversity Global Summit, Collaborative WIM, taking place on November 10th. We have a fantastic lineup of guest speakers, maybe even a fun activity or two, and we're even hoping to continue the conversation with Parneet. So we really appreciate everyone's participation and help organizing today's event. Thank you, Parneet, for all of your time and your insights. It's just been a fascinating conversation and so much to take away.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. And yeah, I have to say, such an amazing effort with the collaborative WIM. I mean, you guys are literally embodying everything that we spoke about today. So really honored to be introduced to this group, and really well done. Please do take good care of yourselves.
Thank you so much, Parneet.
You as well.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Parneet.
everyone.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.